It was winter of 2015, and I'd set out for a solo camping trip that I'll never forget. Usually, I avoid camping in isolated spots. I prefer to stay close to the usual hiking trails or campgrounds where there's some kind of safety net if things go wrong. But this time, I wanted something different. I craved solitude, complete, uninterrupted peace, away from the noise and distractions of the city. So, I packed up some essentials to my van and drove far from my small town in Virginia, venturing deep into the remote wilderness, determined to find a secluded spot where no one could find me. The drive was long, and the further I went, the more dark it became. By the time I'd reached the place I'd mapped out, I'd traveled for miles. The night out there was so complete, so absolute that I couldn't see a single thing, not even the edge of the road. I had all the essentials packed: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a day, and my gear to keep me comfortable for a night in the wild. I was ready to be alone. I chose my spot carefully. The area was isolated, far from any property or trails, and it was hidden from view by the dense trees and hills surrounding it. I made sure no one could easily see me, and I took precautions to make sure I wasn't near any private land or hunting grounds. It was perfect quiet, remote, just what I needed to clear my head. I set up my tent next to the van, the cool winter air biting at my skin as I worked. Afterward, I built a small fire to keep warm. I'd cooked a simple dinner, enjoying the peaceful surroundings. I ate slowly, savoring every moment as much as I can. It was around 11 p.m. at night. I decided it was time to call it a night. I locked the van's doors and crawled into my sleeping bag. I was finally able to relax completely. I had no worries, no distractions, just the solitude I'd been craving. But around midnight, I woke up to the sound outside. I thought it was just the wind. My eyes fluttered open, and I strained my ears to listen. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something deliberate. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something or someone was out there. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart beating a little faster now. I listened carefully. The noise continued, getting closer, like footsteps in the leaves. My pulse quickened. It wasn't an animal, I realized. It was something else. My instincts told me something was wrong. I froze, listening as one of the voices grew louder, speaking in low tones, though I couldn't make out the words. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. A sharp clink noise like a sound of metal. I heard it again. They were trying to open the back door of my van with a crowbar. These men weren't here for anything good. Maybe they just wanted to rob me. Either way, the danger was real. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The sound of the crowbar scraping against the door grew louder and more frantic. There was no time to waste. I dove into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition, desperate to get out of there fast. Suddenly, one of the men shouted, "Hey, you bastard!" "Stop! Stop right now!" And then he slammed the crowbar against the back window, sending a jolt of fear through me. My heart raced as I looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights in the distance. They were chasing me. The men, whoever they were, shooting at the back of the van, desperately trying to navigate the treacherous terrain whirled around rocks and trees, the van skidding dangerously close to the edge of the road. The men were persistent, closing in on me. I could barely see the road ahead. Somehow, I finally made it to a small town. My heart was racing loudly. I pulled into a gas station and slammed the van into park. I jumped out, rushed to the phone, and called the authorities. I told them everything: the men, the chase, the gunfire. They promised they'd send someone to investigate, but deep down, I knew the chances of finding them were slim. I drove back home later that morning, my mind racing with questions. Who were those men? What had they been after? The tension of the moment weighed heavily on me. I had narrowly escaped something far worse. It took me many months to build up my RV exactly how I wanted it for camping. I wasn't one of those people who just bought an RV and hit the road. I wanted something that felt like home, a cozy base where I could settle in, no matter how remote the location. I added all the facilities I thought I'd need: a small kitchenette, a comfy bed, a little shower, and some basic tech to keep me entertained during long nights. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I was proud of the way it turned out. I'm usually into buying and selling things here and there, flipping items when I get the chance, but this RV felt different. It was personal. So, when I finally got it just right, I figured it was time to put it to good use and hit the road for a solo trip. I had heard a lot about the Appalachian Mountains, both good and bad. Some people spoke of it as this mystical, beautiful place, great for hiking and finding peace in nature. But then there were the others, the ones who warned about its isolation, its unpredictability, and even stranger tales of the region being not so safe for those who ventured too far off the beaten path. I packed up the ERV with everything I'd need, put it in gear, and set off toward the mountains, thinking I knew what I was getting myself into. I found a spot tucked away in a quiet, secluded corner of the mountains. It was exactly what I wanted, completely isolated, with no signs of life for miles. The roads were rough, winding up through the trees until they finally gave way to a little clearing. I parked the ERV, took a moment to appreciate the peace, and then set about making camp. It was getting late, so I built a fire outside to keep warm as the temperature dropped. I ate a roasted meat and thought to myself that this was exactly what I needed. By the time the fire burned down to embers, I was ready to call it a night. I locked the ERV door, crawled into my bed, and wrapped myself up in my blankets. The silence was almost overwhelming, but it was the kind of silence I craved. No traffic, no streetlights, just the sounds of the wilderness around me. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt completely at peace, convinced this was the best decision I'd made in a long time. But that peace didn't last. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. But then I heard it again. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more clearly. The voices were getting closer. My mind raced. There was no way anyone else should be out here. The place was so isolated. I held my breath, straining to listen. I could hear footsteps, circling around the RV, getting closer. Though I couldn't see them, the chanting grew louder and more urgent. I struggled to make out their words. It wasn't a language I recognized. My first instinct was to remain silent and hidden. I locked the RV doors tighter, my hands trembling as I pulled the curtains closed. Whoever they were, I knew I had to stay out of sight. They were right outside now, and the tension in the air felt almost palpable. Then there was a loud bang, the sound of someone slamming their fist against the RV door. I froze, my blood running cold. The chanting stopped for a moment, then started again, more frantic, as if they were urging each other on. Bang! Another slam. I could hear their muffled voices just beyond the door, and then crash. The window shattered, sending glass spraying across the floor of the RV. The panic hit me like a wave. I scrambled out of bed, searching for keys. I had no idea what they wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I started the engine, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I slammed down on the gas pedal and sped away. I caught a glimpse through the side window. 3 masked figures were chasing after me on foot. My heart raced in my chest as I pressed the accelerator harder, desperately trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever they were. I couldn't afford to stop. I had no idea what would happen if I did. When I finally reached the small town down the mountain, I called the police immediately to report what had happened. Their response was disheartening. They didn't seem particularly interested, telling me it occurred in isolated areas and that I should have heeded the warning signs. The entire experience was terrifying, and I kept asking myself, what if I hadn't had the ERV? What if I'd been on foot, camping in a tent, or without any shelter at all? What would have happened to me then? Would I have been taken? Would I have survived the night? Would I even have made it back? These questions haunted me for days after I returned home. I couldn't shake the image of those figures just beyond my reach, watching and waiting. And the worst part, not knowing what they wanted, why they were there, or if they would come back. This happened nearly around 2 years back, I guess. It was the first time I decided to take a camping trip to a place that looked completely abandoned, isolated. I was in the mood for some stealth camping, the kind where you go off the beaten path and pitch your tent somewhere hidden away from prying eyes. I didn't want to be near any marked campgrounds or areas with other campers. I wanted to get lost for the night and enjoy the silence. So, I found a spot deep in the woods of Georgia, somewhere no one would find me. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind, a perfect retreat for just one night. I arrived in the late afternoon and quickly set up camp. The air was cool, but the sun still had some warmth to it. I parked my truck off the narrow, overgrown trail, making sure no one could see me from the road. The area looked abandoned, and I liked it that way. There were no signs of life, just trees and overgrown brush. I gathered some dry wood nearby and got a fire started. After the fire was going strong, I started making dinner, something simple but satisfying, a big, juicy steak. I'd packed it along with some potatoes, planning for a good, hearty meal out here in the wild. It was everything I had hoped for. I was finally in the moment, enjoying my dinner and the calm of the woods. That's when I heard it. Footsteps crunching over dry leaves. My first thought was that it was an animal, a raccoon. I sat up straighter, trying to listen over the fire. The rustling continued, and then I saw them. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, stepping out from between the trees. There were 4 of them men, each one wearing a jacket, and they didn't look friendly. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and a rifle slung over his shoulder, stepped forward. "Who are you?" he barked, his voice sharp and accusing. I tried to keep calm. "I'm just camping for the night," I said, raising my hands slightly to show I wasn't a threat. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. Just wanted some peace and quiet." The man didn't seem convinced. His eyes narrowed as he scanned me, taking in my camping gear. "Ain't no one comes out here alone for no reason. You're spying on us, ain't you?" He pulled the rifle off his shoulder and leveled it at me, the barrel pointing directly at my chest. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel a cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. No, I'm just camping," I repeated, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "I swear, I didn't mean to intrude on anything. I just needed a place to stay for the night." He wasn't listening. The others behind him were all eyeing me warily, one of them glancing at the rifle as though waiting for a command. The man with the gun shifted his weight, his finger twitching on the trigger. "There's been a man hiding out here in the woods. A robber, a thief," he said, his voice low and tense. "People like you don't come out here unless you're part of that mess. You might be working with him." His eyes flicked to the others, and they exchanged glances, their suspicion growing. I opened my mouth to protest, but the man didn't let me speak. "You don't belong here," he growled, taking a step closer. "We've had enough trouble in these woods already. You'd better get out of here before things get ugly." I was trying to stay calm, but this was getting out of hand. "Look, I swear I'm just a camper," I said, raising my hands higher. "I'm just here for one night. I don't know anything about a robber, and I'm not here to spy on anyone." I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. One of the men with him stepped forward, eyes narrow with distrust. "Prove it," the leader said, his voice still sharp. "Show us your gear. Show us what you've got." I did as he asked, pulling my backpack from the ground, emptying the contents to show them I was just a guy with camping gear, nothing suspicious, nothing out of the ordinary. See? Nothing weird, just a tent, a sleeping bag, some food. That's it. The man with the rifle stood there for a long moment, eyeing me like he wasn't sure whether to believe me. Then, finally, he lowered the rifle slightly, though his finger stayed near the trigger. "This is your last warning. If we see you again, we won't be so kind. You come back here, you'll regret it." "I won't, I swear. I'll leave right now." They backed off slowly, not turning their backs on me until they had melted back into the trees. I could still hear their footsteps for a while, and then nothing but silence as I packed up my things, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I didn't even take time to douse the fire properly. I just jumped in my truck and drove off. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of town, my mind reeling from the encounter. I reported what had happened to the local authorities, but they didn't seem interested in investigating. The anger started to creep in. I hadn't expected this. This was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. Instead, I'd been accused, threatened, and scared out of my mind by people I'd never even met. The whole thing had shaken me more than I cared to admit. And as much as I loved the idea of camping alone, I knew one thing for sure: I would never camp alone again. Not after what happened. This happened about 2 years ago, when I was 22. I'd just finished a long week at work, and as usual, I was craving a little peace and quiet. The weekend was here, and I wanted nothing more than to get away from people, from the noise, from everything. Just a night by myself in the woods to recharge. North Carolina's got plenty of spots like that, quiet, isolated. So, I packed up my car with some basic camping gear and headed out. I've always liked camping solo. It's just me, my car, the trees, and a few beers. That's all I needed. I knew this one spot, a quiet trail not far from where I lived, where I could park, set up my camp, and disappear for a bit. It wasn't like there was much chance of running into anyone out there. I parked my car a few yards off the trail, well away from any main paths. I wasn't worried about safety, not really. I mean, I wasn't stupid, but I also wasn't exactly expecting trouble in the middle of nowhere. I set up a fire, grilled some burgers I'd picked up earlier, and cracked open a beer. The air was a bit chilly, so while I cooked my food outside, I eventually retreated to my car to eat and get warm before settling in for the night. At that moment, I felt carefree. As I sat in the car, enjoying my burger and the peaceful night, I suddenly heard a knock on my window. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked out and saw a man standing there, his clothes dirty, as if he had been wandering in the woods for a long time. I rolled the window down a crack. "Hey man, you gotta help me. I'm lost," he said, his voice shaky. "Can you give me a ride to the nearest town? Please, I don't know where I am." Now, I know what you're thinking. Never pick up a stranger in the woods. And normally, I'd agree. Maybe it was the desperation in his voice, or maybe I was just being stupid. Whatever it was, I felt bad for the guy and figured I'd give him a ride. "All right, get in," I said. "But if you try anything, I'll leave you out here, got it?" He nodded quickly, climbed in, and didn't say a word. I kept glancing over at him, trying to gauge his intentions, but he didn't seem dangerous. Just a guy who'd gotten lost, I thought. I figured it'd be a quick drive, and then we'd part ways. I started the car, and we headed out. It was quiet in the car, and the more I thought about it, the more I wondered why he hadn't mentioned where he was from or how he got lost. But I didn't push it. Maybe he was just in shock or something. But then, things took a turn. I don't know what the fuck set him off, but suddenly, without a second, he lunged at me. I didn't even have time to process it 1 second. He was just sitting there, and the next, his hands were around my neck, choking the life out of me. I couldn't breathe. My hands scrambled for the wheel, but my mind was completely scrambled. Panic hit me like a goddamn hammer. I slammed my foot on the gas, but the car didn't respond. My vision blurred, my throat was closing, and I couldn't get a single breath with all the strength I had left. I threw my body to the side, trying to break free. I swerved the car. The next thing I knew, the car veered off the road, crashing straight into a tree. The impact was brutal. The airbags exploded in my face, and everything went dark for a second. My head was spinning, but I was alive. I didn't wait for him to recover. I threw open the door, stumbled out of the car, and bolted. I didn't know where I was going, but I wasn't about to die next to a wrecked car in the middle of nowhere. I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran. I heard him coming after me, his footsteps heavy and fast, getting closer. I could barely catch my breath, but I pushed on. My legs were burning and my chest felt like it was going to explode, but I kept running. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a flickering light, a campfire. A group of campers. I didn't think twice. I ran toward them, begging for help. The campers looked at me, saw the man chasing me, and quickly understood what was happening. One of them grabbed a rifle and pointed it at the guy chasing me, who hesitated for a moment. Then, suddenly, he turned and ran off into the woods. The camper fired a warning shot into the air, and just like that, the danger disappeared into the darkness. The police showed up a little while later. They arrested the guy, and it turned out he wasn't just some lost wanderer. He was a criminal who'd been targeting campers in the area. Apparently, he had a history of attacking people who were out in remote spots. I was lucky to make it out alive. I ended up in the hospital with a few minor but painful wounds, bruises all over, and a serious concussion. They kept me for 2 days to make sure there wasn't anything worse going on. I didn't return to work for a while. Honestly, I was rattled. I couldn't even step outside without feeling like someone was following me. I eventually got back to normal, but I'll never be the same. That night, that guy, it messed with my head. And I sure as hell don't camp alone anymore. I bought a pocket knife after that. Not that I ever expected to use it, but just in case. I don't trust people the way I used to, and I never will again. What happened that night will stick with me for the rest of my life. That day had been rough. My wife and I had been fighting for hours, the kind of petty bickering that just never seems to stop once it gets going. I was fed up with it, fed up with the constant noise, so I grabbed my shit, told her I needed to get away for a bit, and I hit the road. I didn't even know where I was going, just somewhere far from her, far from the bullshit. I needed peace. I'm not the type to book a fancy campsite or stay in crowded spots, so I figured I'd just drive out into the woods of Maine. It's remote, quiet, and not full of people looking to ruin the peace. I had my car packed with gear tent, some food. No plans, just me, the woods, and some space to think. I didn't care about the details. I just needed to escape. I ended up picking a spot off the beaten path, one of those places that's not an official campsite. It was isolated, tucked into the trees, with no one around for miles. I parked the car, set up a small fire, and cracked open a beer. I grilled a steak, ate it alone, and felt my nerves settle. I spent the night in my car, listening to the sounds of the forest. Nothing happened. It was peaceful. But the next day, after a long hike, things started to take a strange turn. I came back to the car, wiped the sweat from my face, and noticed something was off. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left, but there it was, open just enough to make me pause. At first, I figured maybe I'd just forgotten, or maybe the wind had done it. But then I saw the note. It was tucked under the windshield wiper, a crumpled piece of paper with jagged handwriting. It said only one thing: leave. My heart skipped a beat. I froze for a second, staring at it. Was this some kind of prank? Maybe someone was messing with me. I couldn't think of any other reason for it. I laughed it off, figuring it was just some local asshole trying to freak me out. It wasn't the first time I'd heard of people pulling shit like this. Still, I wasn't about to let some bullshit note ruin my weekend. So, I shrugged it off, locked the car, and decided to stay another night. What the hell, right? It was probably nothing. That night, things were quiet again. But that note kept nagging at the back of my mind. Was someone really watching me out here? Still, nothing happened. I went to sleep in the back of my car, the doors locked tight, and thought about heading back home the next morning. Then, around 9 in the morning, as I was getting ready to pack up and leave, I noticed them. 2 tall guys dressed in black were standing right next to my car. At first, I thought they might be hunters seeking some privacy. But then I spotted the rifle slung over their shoulders, and a knot formed in my stomach. Something told me this wasn't going to end well. One of them walked toward me, his eyes cold, his face stone. He didn't say a word at first, just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable second. Then, with a calm that made my blood run cold, he raised the rifle and pressed it against my chest. "This is our property," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You don't belong here." My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know this was your land," I stammered. "I'm just here, camping for the night. I'm not causing trouble." The other guy didn't say anything. He just started going through my stuff, pulling open the car doors, rifling through my gear. "You don't get to just camp wherever the fuck you want," the guy with the rifle said, his voice getting colder. "You've been warned. What the hell are you doing out here?" I tried to stay calm, but I was losing it inside. "I'm just here for a night. I didn't know. Look, I'll leave. I'll never come back. Just let me go." But they weren't listening. The guy with the rifle pushed it harder into my head. The other guy kept checking my stuff, pulling out anything valuable he could find: my wallet, my watch, even my phone. It felt like they were taking everything. "You're lucky we don't just take you out here," the guy said, almost like a threat that hung in the air. "Get the fuck out, and don't ever come back." I couldn't get the words out fast enough. I was shaking, crying from fear, begging them to let me go. Finally, they shoved me toward my car. The guy with the rifle didn't even lower it, still watching me like I was some kind of animal. I jumped into the car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely start the engine. I didn't look back. I didn't even stop until I was back home. I didn't care how fast I was going. I just needed to get the hell out of there. When I got home, I was a complete wreck. My wife could see it right away. She asked me what had happened, and I broke down. I told her everything: how scared I had been, how those guys had threatened me and taken my stuff. She held me and told me she was sorry. But honestly, I couldn't shake it. That fear, it lingered with me. I can't go in those remote spots anymore. That night haunted me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of just how easy it is to end up in a situation you can't control. And I know for certain that I'll never go back to those places again.